So, descriptive moral relativism or descriptive cultural relativism is just a set of observations that Rachel takes as established facts, as evidence that has to be taken into consideration in mediating any theoretical disputes between views about the nature of morality or how we ought to go about conducting our lives. And so he thinks that every view is going to have to either show how those facts support their view or show why those facts don't undermine their view. So the first view that we want to look at here is a view that I call meta-ethical moral objectivism. It's also sometimes called universalism. And it's a view about the nature of all moral judgments. And because it's about all moral judgments, I call it meta-ethical. That is, it's about ethics or ethical judgments. Meta-ethical moral objectivism holds that true moral judgments are true universally or objectively, and false moral judgments are false universally and objectively. In short, there is a universal basis for morality. There are features of the world that remain constant across time and circumstance that make judgments true or false. And that view about the nature of moral judgments and what makes them true or false is referred to as meta-ethical moral objectivism, universalism, or moral objectivism. Now, it has a companion view, an associated view, and that view is normative moral objectivism. Normative moral objectivism is a claim about how we ought to behave, and it bases that claim on the supposed truth of meta-ethical moral objectivism. So, normative moral objectivism asserts that our actions ought to be guided by universally true moral norms. So, in our ethical and moral behaviors, we should be trying to seek out and reach consensus about the universally true moral judgments, and then use the norms contained in those judgments to guide our actions. So we can think of the sort of world that normative moral objectivism predicts in terms of a sort of famous quote from Eddie Griffin from a 2003 movie called The New Guy, where he said, "High school's a lot like prison." So in our context here, high school's a lot like prison according to normative moral objectivism, because the facts that make our moral judgments true in high school are the same facts that make our moral judgments true in prison. So there is an objective aspect of the world that renders moral judgments true across context, across time, so that in high school or prison, wherever it is, what the right thing to do will always be determined by those same objective features about the nature of reality. The next view that we want to look at is the view that Rachel's is focused on primarily in his chapter. And that view is what I call meta-ethical moral relativism. Sometimes it's just called moral relativism. And it asserts that moral judgments, insofar as we can understand them as being true or false, or we can say that they're justified or unjustified, they get that status only relative to features of the world that are inherent to social context, to cultures, to groups of individuals. Right? Only when we have groups that share traditions, convictions, practices, moral values, do we have features that allow us to say that moral judgments are true or false. They're not true or false independent of those contexts or cultures. They're only true within or relative to those cultures or contexts. And so we can sort of think about the difference between meta-ethical moral relativism and meta-ethical moral objectivism using this little animated GIF I've got down here. So Bart is the advocate of meta-ethical moral objectivism. Killing, on Bart's view, is wrong. Objectively, in all cases, all circumstances, it is an objective truth that can be recognized. Our judgment that killing is wrong is true. Homer, on the other hand, advocates moral relativism, arguing that what makes killing right or wrong is relative, in Homer's case, to individuals. So it is wrong for Bart, but it is right for Homer. All right, so what makes that judgment true are the circumstances of Homer's situation. Right? And so we see the difference between the objectivist and the relativist implications for our behaviors. Metaethical moral relativism has a normative counterpart as well. And normative moral relativism makes a prescriptive, makes prescriptions about how we ought to regulate our moral and ethical lives, and it asserts that we ought to do what we ought to do is relative to the traditions, convictions, practices, moral values, etc., of the group or culture in which we find ourselves. And so it says that what's the appropriate moral behavior, how we should regulate our behavior is determined by the consensus, practices, values, norms that we find in the culture that we happen to be in. And so, for example, if we're in banal Spain, it would be morally acceptable to throw tomatoes if we happen to be there during the tomato throwing festival that they have every year. Now, if we're in the United States, we're in a different culture, there are no traditions, there are no practices that make tomato throwing morally acceptable in certain circumstances. It's generally morally considered to be a bad thing to hurl tomatoes at each other. Right? And that would be something that the moral relativist would say. Morally acceptable in the context of the tomato throwing festival in Spain, morally unacceptable in the context of sitting around, say, in your classes at CSULB. And we find similar cases all over the place. So, for example, in 2009, the Indian government stepped in and banned this regional, apparently not too uncommon, ceremony in which babies and toddlers were tossed some 30 feet or more from the roofs of shrines, and they were caught by people below in sheets. And this was a practice, a ceremony that they had. And it was both for Hindus and Muslims. It wasn't particularly endemic of any particular religious belief, but it was endemic to particular regions in India. And so the normative moral relativist would say, well, within those regions of India, it is morally acceptable to toss babies off the shrine during the ceremony. In the larger Indian culture, it's morally unacceptable to do so. Finally, we want to note 3 additional positions, and we've discussed at least 2 of these positions in previous lectures. So, moral nihilism, what I'm calling here metaethical moral nihilism, as you recall, denies that there are any moral truths at all. There are no objective facts that render our moral judgments true, no objective facts that render our moral judgments false. There are no culturally relative facts that render them true, and no culturally relative facts that render them false. There just isn't anything that makes our judgments true or false. Nihilists also tend to hold 2 related views. They tend to be metaethical moral skeptics, that is, they deny that we can know moral truths, precisely because they deny that there are objective or relative moral truths to be known. So if they don't exist, we can't know what they are. And normative moral nihilism, which asserts that what one ought to do cannot be constrained by true moral norms, since there are no true moral norms. Moral and ethical properties are just not features of the universe, and hence they can't be used to regulate our behaviors.